Interest groups. We're going to start with interest groups, their origin, and the perception that people have of them. In Federalist Paper 10, James Madison spoke of interest groups and understood that if you were going to have a democracy with certain civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and the freedom to criticize your government, you were going to have interest groups. So our system is designed that many interests can be heard. That's what democracy is about. Madison in Federalist Paper 10 spoke that the most durable source or common source of factions or interest groups, because back then they were calling them factions, but we call them interest groups now. The most durable source of these factions or interest groups would be unequal distribution of property. And what you would have is people who would organize in certain situations in order to acquire property. But you couldn't get rid of them. You couldn't stop the common man from trying to petition their government or criticize their government for being unable to help them be more successful. So you can't eliminate their causes because their causes are freedom of speech and freedom of press, but you can mitigate or lessen their effects. And the way we mitigate or lessen their effects is through our system. Our constitutional government is set up in a way that will check the influence of factions. If you have a large republic, you're going to have many voices that have to be heard, so one voice won't necessarily be louder than any other. That's kind of like the idea of pluralism. Checks and balances. If a faction or an interest group were to take over one branch of government, you have the other two branches that are going to put that faction in their place. Separation of powers works in that same philosophy, that each branch of government is given a specific power, and they will be unwilling to let their power go to a branch of government that might be taken over by a faction. And federalism. Federalism, if a faction takes over a couple of state governments or an interest group takes over a couple of state governments, they're not going to be able to change, under the supremacy clause, they won't be able to change how the federal government works, or they won't be able to overturn what is constitutional law. Also with federalism, if a faction takes over at the national level and in Congress, both houses of Congress propose an amendment, it'll take 3/4 of the state to agree to that amendment. So our system is set up in a way to prevent one particular group from taking away or being tyrannical and taking away the rights of the others. Interest groups, roles, and reputation. Definition of an interest group is an organization whose members share common concerns and try to influence the policymakers' decisions. So it's an organization, and the people who are members of the organization have some common concern or something they want the government to address. So they're going to try to influence policy in that way. This is another linkage institution. A linkage institution is linking or connecting the people to the policymakers. Now, political parties were an example of a linkage institution, but the way that political parties are different from interest groups is that interest groups don't run politicians for office. They don't want to win elections. They want to influence the people who run for office and influence the people who win elections, rather than actually be a part of the political system or the policymakers. When you're talking about the reputation of interest groups, there is a true love-hate relationship between Congress and special interest. When campaigning, Congress members complain about the effects of special interest on our political system, and the negative ads run by super PACs and interested groups. Yet, interest groups and Congress really rely on each other. Congress wouldn't be able to do some of the work that they do without the information that interest groups give them during the how a bill becomes a law process. The number of interest groups are growing very rapidly. It is very difficult to think of any part of our entire society that is not represented by an interest group currently, especially business interest groups. Since the 1970s, interest groups representing businesses or type of professional groups have increased, like the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. That's an interest group. The National Restaurant Association, the National Association of Broadcasters. Now, all of those are business groups, and the number of business groups have greatly increased. Now, it is criticized that interest groups have too much influence, that their donations means they influence lawmakers' decisions too much, that they're buying lawmakers' decisions. And we talked about that when we talked about campaigns and elections. Two concepts I want to add to this too much influence is the concept of revolving door and then iron triangle. But I'm going to talk about revolving door first. Revolving door refers to people who might have a job with, let's go to Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers of America. You might have had a job with an interest group or been a lobbyist with an interest group or worked or served on the board of a major pharmaceutical company. And then you run for office and you become a Congress member. And while you're a Congress member, you write laws that deal with pharmaceutical regulations. Then you're no longer a Congress member, you stop being a Congress member, and you go back to serve on the board of the pharmaceutical company. This cartoon right here shows you the magic revolving door, where this guy, he starts in as a corporate, a member of a corporate board. He goes into Congress, he serves in Congress, he writes laws that relate to the private industry that he was a part of, and then he gets out of Congress and he is back in the industry, the private industry, that he wrote laws that affected that industry. So that's a revolving door, and allows people to stay very influential and dominate one particular type of policy. The iron triangle, same kind of idea, that there's too much influence with interest groups. This is a depiction of the iron triangle. I'd get to know the iron triangle. We're going to be talking about the iron triangle for many, many, many months to come. There are three parts of the iron triangle. There are interest groups, Congress, and bureaucratic agencies or government departments like Department of Defense. An interest group gives electoral support to Congress. In return, Congress will give political support and funding to a bureaucratic agency, which will then do special favors for the interest group. So an iron triangle is a mutually beneficial political relationship between interest group, Congress, and government agency. We will talk a lot more about those. Remember to review the groupthink philosophies, pluralism, their competing IGs are healthy, the competition provides information to government officials, and that's a good thing. And the competition prevents any one group from dominating politics, which checks tyranny. But then hyperpluralism is a lot more negative. They believe that competing groups become too powerful and that interest groups, I don't understand what that means, but that interest, sorry about that, guys. That interest groups use too much power to influence Congress members and government agencies. We'll fix that. And then that creates gridlock because Congress members don't know exactly what to do. They don't want to upset any one particular group, so they just decide not to do anything at all. Okay, and then class elitism, that the government officials, because they hear from the elite groups, the elite interests are heard over all else. The power rests in business interests. And again, there's that unbreakable iron triangle between those people who can afford to give electoral support, Congress members, and government agencies. This political cartoon depicts the CEO of General Motors and Obama, and the fact that he, as the CEO of General Motors, benefited from a taxpayer bailout, even though that increased our national debt. So that decision that Obama made had nothing to do with necessarily the public good, rather it had to do with benefiting GM. What makes an interest group successful? Size. You would just assume that a large group with a large membership of people would be the most powerful types of groups. But actually, when you look at the three things that make interest groups successful, size, intensity, and financial resources, smaller groups are more effective than larger ones, sometimes because they can organize and communicate more effectively with their membership. So actually, the smaller and more organized and close-knit your members are is more beneficial than having super large interest groups with millions and millions of people who aren't quite as actively involved. So going back to size, when you're talking about the size of an interest group, you have to note that you have a potential group. These are all of the people who might be members of your interest group because they share a commonality with that group. So over here I have some union posters. These are posters that unions would use when they were striking. Unions are a type of interest group, labor unions. They want to influence government decisions regarding workers' benefits and wages. So their potential group is anybody who is a pipe fitter, or anybody who is a welder, or anybody who is a car manufacturer. Okay, the actual group is the people who are actually members of that interest group, or in this case, the labor union. And they actually pay dues, and they actually work for the collective good. Working for the collective good is organizing to help members of a group. A member of a small group is more likely to experience the group's success, and it's more likely to work harder to achieve the goals of the IG than a member of a large group who doesn't always benefit from what that interest group does. So if you are an actual member of the labor union, you're going to work harder for the labor union, and what the labor union is getting for you is going to be more evident than necessarily like if you aren't an active member of the labor union. Free riders. These are when individuals that benefit from the work of the group without actually joining the group. And free riding is more of a problem with the large interest group. So that's why size actually is better. A smaller size interest group is actually better because everybody feels invested in the work of that group. Intensity. How strong a group's feelings are on an issue. Single issue groups are good for this because they tend to pursue their policy uncompromisingly. Members are more likely to vote on do issue-based voting than anything else. A group with a great level of intensity is the NRA. The people who are members of the NRA feel very strongly about gun rights, and they are going to single issue vote when it comes time to an election to preserve their gun rights. And of course, financial services. Politicians are most likely to serve the needs of a group with money. Money allows you to mobilize voters. Money allows you to conduct research and maintain a strong organization. Money also allows you to electioneer, campaign for a politician. This is part of the reason why welfare recipients don't have their own interest group. Because even though they have a lot at stake in government and they get a lot of benefits from the federal government, because they don't have the financial resources, they're not going to have a strong interest group.